Manila was doomed, but that didn't spoil the party. The Japanese army was drawing closer to the city that had been known before the war as the Pearl of the Orient. The locals were literally heading for the hills, either to hide or form resistance groups for the inevitable Japanese occupation of their country. Manila had been declared an open city by United States General Douglas MacArthur, Far East Commander of American and Filipino forces in the Philippines. He hoped the designation would spare the city he so loved its destruction. The mood in Manila in December of 1941 was one of both anxiety and excitement. Manila citizens and soldiers, along with a few Americans still in the capital, were not promised what tomorrow would bring, so they were making the most of their today. Despite the Japanese bearing down on the city, the dance halls and bars were full. The city's residents and the few American soldiers left were determined there would be one last party before the Pearl became the property of the Empire of Japan.
The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii.
On December 7th, 1941, December 8th, on the other side of the international date line, the Japanese had launched attacks on both the American Pacific Navy fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and later on other American interests in the Pacific, including United States airfields around Manila, such as Clark Field.
Manila has just been bombed. In fact, right now it is being bombed.
I remember the Jap fighters coming over and strafing. And I remember one Jap was so low that I could plainly see the pilot as he approached, and so I emptied my .45 at him without effect.
Japan had declared war on the United States. In the Philippines, American air power had been destroyed on the ground before the fight even started.
And our planes were caught on the ground after being up in the air for some time. The debacle at Clark Field is one that just boggles the mind, considering that Pearl Harbor had happened just, hours before.
Making matters worse was that 43,000 Japanese soldiers were about to begin coming ashore north of Manila.
Within weeks, this is all under their control. The Philippines will fall in April, but by that time, the United States is still reeling from disaster after disaster.
MacArthur ordered his combined American and Filipino troops to retreat south to the dense jungles of the Bataan Peninsula. There they would regroup and start to fight back. Lieutenant Damon Gause, affectionately known as Rocky by his friends, had arrived in the Philippines in November of 1941 as part of Operation Plum. Operation Plum was the code name for the U.S. Army buildup to World War II in the Far East. In November 1941, Gause and some 1,200 other flyers with the 27th Bombardment Group left San Francisco aboard the SS President Coolidge to shore up General MacArthur's defense of the Philippines for a war everyone knew was coming. Lieutenant Damon Gause loved to fly. In the Philippines, Gause was to be assigned a dauntless dive bomber. Damon Rocky Gause was born on June 17, 1915, and raised in the Jefferson Winder area of Georgia. Jefferson and Winder are in the northeast part of the state, about an hour north of Atlanta. The town dates back over 200 years and was named for the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. The city is the county seat of Jackson County and lies in the gently rolling hills and the Piedmont region of Georgia. Growing up in Jackson County, Damon Gause enjoyed listening to country music of the day. Gause also spent as much time as possible outdoors. Rocky wasn't big in stature, just 5 foot 5.5 inches and a solid 165 pounds, but he was tough. Gause was a pretty good boxer and liked to hunt. Both of these passions, while growing up in patriotic Jefferson, would prove very useful later during World War II. Rocky attended the University of Georgia nearby Athens for 1 year, but flying airplanes took precedence over school books, so Gause dropped out of college and began taking flying lessons at nearby Epps Field to earn his pilot's license. After enlisting in the Coast Guard, Rocky joined the Army Air Corps as a radio man and gunner. After being honorably discharged from both branches of the armed forces, he held jobs with the Texaco Oil Company, but his love of flying brought him back to Georgia, where he worked at local airports and continued to log hours as a pilot. In early 1941, 25-year-old Rocky Gause was introduced by his sister to one of her friends, the beautiful Ruth Evans, also from the Jefferson area and 6 years younger than Rocky.
And so we just had fun together.
With war clouds forming over America, Gause enlisted once more, this time qualifying for the U.S. Army Air Corps Cadet School.
There was a little field in Athens, and he took some flying lessons at the little Epps field, and then later there was talking of the war, and he decided he'd wanted to make a pilot and went into service, and then he stayed in and received his wings from Kellyville in Texas. And for some reason, he fell in love with me, and it surprised me.
On October 11th, 1941, Rocky and Ruth eloped. Ruth would join her new husband in the Philippines as soon as possible, as the 27th had been called to overseas duty. 2 weeks after their wedding, Lieutenant Damon Gause was on his way west to meet the SS Coolidge.
He boarded the train in Atlanta to head for San Francisco. They stopped off in Hawaii, and looked around on their way to the Philippines.
In Hawaii for just a short time to get fuel and supplies, Rocky Gause was able to tour the island of Oahu with his buddies, visiting Waikiki Beach and Diamond Head Volcano. The mood in Hawaii would become very serious in less than a month, but in November of 1941, the main island was still paradise for visiting soldiers. In very late November, the Coolidge docked at Manila, the Philippines, the new home of the 27th Bombardment Group. In less than 2 weeks, America would be at war, and Damon, Rocky Gause, would be in the center of the storm. But on December 1st, 1941, there was only enjoyment of what the Pearl of the Orient had to offer for American soldiers just off the transport ships: bars, golf, and military exercises among the palm trees and under a gleaming sun. That was until December 8th, when the Japanese rudely interrupted life for Damon Rocky Gause and thousands of other Americans in Manila. Rocky had survived that day, but his future, like so many others in the Philippines, was now very uncertain.
It was indeed a strange sight. I doubt if the Empire Room in the Manila Hotel had ever been host to as varied a conglomeration of people. The Japanese were expected in Manila within a few hours, and the bars were well patronized. I thought of the boys digging in on Bataan. They would never believe that I celebrated the approach of a new year and the Japanese army from a front row seat in the doomed city. We were the only American soldiers in the place.
Lieutenant Damon Gause and another soldier, Clay Connor, had been sent to the city to find needed radio parts that were left behind as American soldiers retreated to Bataan ahead of the oncoming Japanese. But first, why not drink to what had been?
The marble pillar lobby of the Hotel Manila, where General MacArthur had made his headquarters, was quiet and deserted. and our heels clacked ominously on the shining floor as we walked towards the door.
A young, beautiful Filipino woman named Rita Garcia had joined the Americans at the Manila Hotel that night. During the attack on December 8th, Rocky Gause had found the girl wounded in a street and carried her to a local hospital.
Again, I told her that I hadn't saved her life, but she insisted that I had.
Damon Gause and Rita Garcia would cross paths again in just a few months. On January 1st, 1942, Rocky Gause and the other soldiers he had partied with on New Year's Eve in Manila were on their way back to Bataan, where some 80,000 American and Filipino soldiers were hunkered down on the mountainous peninsula, preparing for the fight that was to come.
He got a message through to me the week of war, still lucky, giving them hell. And that's the last message I had from him for several months.
Our small 4-truck convoy was to move out of Manila just before dawn, along the road that skirted Bataan Bay, through the town of San Fernando at the northern tip, and then into Bataan. There was little traffic on the road now, although large numbers of Filipinos, sometimes entire families, struggled toward Bataan hoping to obtain protection from the Japanese troops. We could hear the crackling of Japanese rifle fire as we reached the northern end of the bay, and when we passed through the deserted village of San Fernando, we heard the shouts of advancing Japanese soldiers. About nightfall, we encountered American troops, this time much more coordinated and settled than they had been when I reached Bataan on December 26th. We were ready now for the grim business ahead. Our little convoy, therefore, was the last to get safely out of Manila.
With no American planes available, Lieutenant Damon Gause and the other airmen of the 27th Bombardment Group were in line for new jobs.
Due to a lack of trained infantrymen in Bataan, the Air Corps men and officers were organized into an infantry regiment. We defended the sector between Manila Bay on the right to the foothills of the Central Mountains on the left, a frontal distance of approximately 30 kilometers. Utilizing the air-cooled machine guns that we brought from the States to install on our Douglas Dauntless dive bombers, which never arrived, we established ourselves to defend our allotted sector of the line.
During the early days of 1942, the Japanese continued to push down the Bataan Peninsula, forcing American and Filipino troops up against the South China Sea and Manila Bay with no place else to go. The only hope was for the United States Navy to send its fleet to rescue the battling bastards of Bataan. But despite hopes and prayers and rumors to the contrary, that wasn't an option.
The American forces at Pearl Harbor, in particular the main battle line of the Pacific Fleet, have been sunk and damaged heavily. And the isolation of the force in the Philippines have only one option: fight to the finish and hope we can get there. The critical part of the story, what was our capability? And unfortunately for those poor men, that will be the largest surrender of American forces in our history. There's no way to relieve them.
Thousands of soldiers on Bataan were on their own, facing widespread disease, hunger, and thirst, and Japan's finest troops on the verge of surrounding them.
We were fortunate that for the first 2-3 weeks, the Japanese didn't make a strong assault on our sector. The first week in January brought the first heavy enemy attack on this front, during which an estimated 15,000 Japanese were killed or wounded. I was commanding a machine gun company boasting 20 of the best aerial machine gunners in the Army. Our men were on the alert at all times, and that was tiring. Finally, by strength of numbers, the Japanese broke through along the bay side, and the American and Filipino forces fell back to a previously prepared defense sector on the China Sea. Our Air Corps men soon learned the tricks of the infantry trade and became as much at home in a slit trench or foxhole as a professional infantryman. The heat never let up at any time. It caused us nearly as much discomfort as the Japanese. The mosquitoes were no respecters of rank, and annoyed colonels and privates alike. About 80,000 Filipino and American troops and 4,000 or 5,000 civilians with their families were on Bataan at this time. And by the end of February, the food situation was desperate. The constant hammering by air and from artillery, and the knowledge that we could do little beside wait for the Japanese to make the next move, was discouraging. Still, the enemy kept coming on, and the day and night attacks by air were relentless. Monkeys tasted like roast beef to the hungry men. Near the end of March, we noticed that a heavy dive bomber and artillery attack was being launched on Corregidor. We were simply worn out physically and facing tremendous odds in materials and supplies when the Japanese finally broke through. During those days, we were never without the boom and crash of bombs and shells in our ears. And what had been verdant jungle when we arrived on Bataan was now shattered trees and stumps and trampled grass and underbrush. On the morning of April 8th, rumors straggled along the line that Japanese infantrymen were pouring through the middle of our line. There'd been so many rumors up to that time that we were still stuck steadfastly at our post. But at noon, the order was received to fall back.
On April 9th, desperate for supplies for his men, Damon Gause and another soldier, Sergeant Wilmer Baker, took an army truck and went looking for a nearby supply depot. What they found instead was a Japanese patrol.
At least one of the Japanese shouted something that we knew meant halt or surrender. Baker leapt out of the truck, and I was right on his heels. The Japanese stirred from their lethargy and opened up with their forward machine gun. But it was 2 steps to the bridge rail, and we both went over and into the water, 20 feet below. Although low, there was still a swift current in the river, and in a few moments we were carried 100 feet downstream. The sergeant and I removed our shirts. I carefully tucked my silver wings into my trouser pocket. We unlaced our shoes and buried them in the mud. Then we proceeded cautiously downstream, keeping in the covering shadows of the bank. We hoped to get back through our own lines. The bank above my head quivered from the weight of the approaching soldiers. The bayonet steel slicing the water is the most annoying sound I've ever heard. As the soldiers came closer, cursing and swearing and hurrying from one open place to another along the bank, looking for our heads in the water, we stretched out and buried ourselves in the mud and water to our necks. My heart was pumping violently, and my mouth was dry, although I was immersed in dirty river water.
As darkness fell, tired and covered in caked-on mud, Gause and Baker started to make their way back to the tip of the Bataan Peninsula. Their route to freedom took them through a nearby Japanese camp full of sleeping enemy soldiers. They reached the beach on the other side of the Japanese camp and dove into the surf.
Sergeant Baker and I became separated.
Wilmer Baker had disappeared. Rocky Gause was now on his own.
I went back to the beach and the water and tried to work my way farther down the peninsula, but I discovered I wasn't as strong as I thought, and I finally came ashore after perhaps 100 yards. I located a narrow trail and was stumbling aimlessly along when 2 Japanese soldiers loomed up right in front of me. I've been told that the enemy made a distinction between officers and enlisted men after capture. So I sat up, fished my flyer's wings out of my pocket, and fastened them carefully to my shirt. I had moved 10 yards from where I'd flattened the grass when a lone Japanese carrying a rifle with a fixed bayonet stopped me. His answer was a slap in the face, and he stepped back with his rifle pointed, daring me to act. I thought he was going to shoot regardless of whether I moved or not. Instead, he prodded me in the stomach with the needle-like point and kept alternately shoving me with the butt and sticking me till we reached a clearing where about 300 American soldiers were huddled together in a prison enclosure. The Japanese guards lorded it over these silent, helpless creatures like slave masters of old, beating some and bayoneting others on the slightest provocation. On the shore side of the prison enclosure, was a 200-yard strip of jungle, and then Manila Bay. I decided I'd better make a break before the Japanese stopped their looting and became fully organized. I spoke to several of the healthiest appearing Americans, inviting them to accompany me. They shook their heads in refusal and said I'd never get out alive. They felt that they had performed their duty valiantly and were disillusioned and sick of fighting a hopeless, one-sided fight. My first thought was to try for the gun, but it might not be loaded. As he drew abreast, I glimpsed a sheathed knife at his side. There was not time to plan further. He passed, and I leapt on his back, pressing my left forearm against his throat with all my strength and grabbing for the knife with my right. He twisted and writhed, screaming. At last, the knife came free, and I slid it into his back as far as it would go. I felt his body relax, and I let him drop. With the knife in my hand, I sprinted into the bush. The captured soldiers had watched my act without a sound, but the guards' cries had brought other Japanese guards. As I ran, I heard them shouting and crashing through the underbrush behind me. Suddenly, I had superhuman strength and leapt over boulders and fallen trees with ease. A few shots fired from the rear encouraged me to increase my lead. Jesse Owens wouldn't have had a showing with me on this dash. When I burst out on the beach, I picked up a driftwood plank and kept right on running with bounding leaps into the waves. I was 100 yards out in the water when my pursuers appeared on the sand, and I was already churning the water in the direction of Corregidor, 3 miles away. They fired volley after volley in my direction, but they fortunately were no better riflemen than other Japanese I'd encountered.
Rocky Gause pulled himself aboard a shipwreck, still within eyesight of the enemy soldiers on Bataan.
Looking toward shore, I saw that my friends of the morning had mounted 3 machine guns on the beach and were taking pot shots at me. They must have seen me crawl aboard the ship, and the only reason I could imagine why they didn't come out after me was that they'd wagered on who would kill me. It was the usual Japanese conceit.
Back into the water, Gause swam towards the American-held island fortress of Corregidor and away from Bataan, where the infamous death march was now underway. Some 76,000 prisoners were starting a forced march some 65 miles in sweltering conditions, all the while being brutalized by their Japanese guards.
And one of the first guys I ran into was a Jap officer, and he had a pretty good-sized pistol. And he put it right up to my head, and he was pulling the trigger, and I thought that I was going to end up right there. But he didn't have any shells in there. And so I guess he was just trying to scare hell out of people.
An estimated 10,000 Americans and Filipinos died from disease or were killed along the route by the Japanese.
So about sundown on April 11th, I crawled ashore at Corregidor. My eyes were nearly closed, and I was bearded, cut, and bruised, literally broiled from the sun and water, and entirely spent. Then I realized I was in bed, and I peered hard through my swollen and half-closed eyelids. I was in Malenta Tunnel on Corregidor, all right, and a nurse was shaking my shoulder. I felt my legs, and the cuts and sores had been bandaged. The nurse returned and applied compresses to my eyes, and when I opened them a little later at her counsel, I was sure I was in heaven and not a Corregidor hospital. Smiling down at me was Millie Dalton, one of my high school chums. I blinked my eyes and gasped with surprise. It was difficult to focus my thoughts. I wondered if I'd been having a bad dream and was really back in that sleepy little town in Georgia, and my mother was trying to awaken me for breakfast. After I sputtered a dozen unintelligible questions, Millie explained patiently that she'd left Georgia after we'd finished school and entered the Army Nurse Corps after completing nurses training. She'd been in the Philippines for a year prior to the war. Millie and I talked about home, our folks, and what we'd been doing. She fed me broth, and I worked up to good, solid food. The next morning, I felt completely revived and persuaded the doctor to get me some clothes and let me return to duty. Before the Japanese unleashed their fury on Corregidor, it was a beautiful, dark green volcanic isle, about 1/3 the size of Manhattan. It was shaped like a tadpole, being high and wide at the seaward end and tapering off to a low point on the bay side. When the bombardment finally let up, the once beautiful island resembled the pockmarked surface of the moon.
Thanks to the care given by Millie Dalton, Rocky Gause was soon up and around and back in the fight. What remained of it, anyway, as both American and Filipino soldiers looked to defend Corregidor. After the fall of Bataan, the island of Corregidor, guarding the entrance to Manila Bay, had become the Alamo of the Pacific. There was nowhere else for Allied troops and Rocky Gause to go. This was the end of the line in the Philippines. General MacArthur had already left the island for Australia by order of President Roosevelt.
I was immediately assigned to the beach defense of Corregidor on the Bataan side, with the 2nd Battalion of the U.S. 4th Marines from China. After 2 weeks, I was given a machine gun company of my own, made up of Filipino troops. A few Marines were also in the group. Lieutenant Alberto Aranzazo, a 23-year-old Filipino pilot, was my second in command. During the day, the Japanese poured shells into every part of the island, but concentrated exceptionally heavy fire for a part of each day on each sector. They were softening us up for the attack we all knew would come. The enemy fire was so heavy and continuous that it became impossible to wash, cook food, or even stand up to stretch your legs. April 29th is Hirohito's birthday, and the Japanese must have planned a big celebration for that day. We didn't know they could train as many guns on the island as they opened up with beginning at 8 o'clock that morning. They used artillery, machine guns, mortars, horizontal and dive bombers, the works. They maintained that tempo until the island was surrendered. There wasn't a moment, night or day, that a high explosive didn't dent Corregidor.
I'd never heard anything like it in my life. You could hear the sounds of the guns first before the shells would get there.
Listen, Yankee brothers, this is your Japanese sister, the voice of truth. This morning they are forcing you to attempt the impossible, for it is impossible for you to dislodge our forces.
Our sector on the northern edge was never attacked by a landing party, but we learned later in the morning that the Japanese had put about 2,000 of their best seasoned troops ashore. They kept coming out of the water in endless, ghost-like waves. Their equipment was far superior, but our ragged, half-starved Filipino and American defenders were not pushed back. All morning on the 5th, the sounds of battle grew in intensity. But at noon, General Jonathan Skinny Wainwright walked out on the battle line, and with tears in his eyes and voice trembling, he ordered the surrender of the last American stronghold in the Far East.
This is Lieutenant General Wainwright. Subject, surrender.
So we got down to the Maleta Tunnel area, and down there was just a huge crush of men with no organization, just all mixed up together. And you just quickly lost control of your own men. I think they came probably at least to 12,000 in all. And there was no water to drink, and there was no food to eat.
Even then, I had completed plans with Lieutenant Alberto Aranzazo to escape Corregidor, because I knew what would happen to me if the Japanese should catch me again, as they had a good description from several sources.
A Filipino scout joined in their escape attempt. Millie Dalton wanted to leave with Gause's small group too, but Rocky told her best chance of survival was to stay where she was.
I had never felt so low. But I turned and ran with the Filipino for whatever cover the northern edge of the island might afford until nightfall, when we could start for the mainland, 6 miles across the bay. We hadn't covered a quarter of a mile when we heard motorized equipment, Japanese of course, thunder up to the main tunnel, and then there was loud talking and shouts and a scream. We got away fast. Aranzazo and I at last flopped breathless under the protective shadows of a beach cliff on the northern edge of Corregidor, and damned the Japanese. They had resumed their bombardment of Corregidor, undoubtedly out of anger because General Wainwright refused to order men on other islands in the Philippines to surrender also. American and Filipino soldiers were standing around unarmed and helpless in the barrage. About 7 o'clock, we ventured out of our hiding place to scout around in the gathering dusk for some means of getting across the bay to the mainland. A short walk up the beach revealed a sluggish-looking native outrigger that had washed up on the sands. It was duly launched, and the Filipino flyer and I were heading into the waves about 200 feet offshore. The night was dark and the sea was choppy. We headed into the wind, and our paddles lifted and dipped, lifted and dipped. Shells and bombs were still bursting on Corregidor. When dawn broke, we weren't a third of the way from Corregidor to the mainland. Treacherous cross-currents carried us sideways during the night, and we made little headway in the water-filled boat. We were debating what to do next when a Japanese fighter plane peeled off from a formation and fired a few bursts at us. The bullets spat into the water alongside the boat as the three of us went over the side. And when I came up, Lieutenant Aranzazo's voice rang in my ears. "I've been hit!" It was becoming more difficult to stay afloat, and all of us swallowed large quantities of salt water. Combination of hunger, thirst, exhaustion, and exposure made me a little delirious, and for the first time I lost hope. All day the scout and I swam against the wind and choppy seas, pushing the wounded officer whose arms were draped over the bamboo poles. Late in the afternoon, we were several hundred yards from shore, but there was such a strong offshore current, and we were so weak, that every movement of our arms was a struggle, and we could not pierce the swirling belt of water between us and safety.
Somewhere along the route across Manila Bay, close to the Philippine mainland, the Filipino pilot disappeared from view.
I swam with vigor for a short ways and then looked back to see if by chance Aranzazo's head had bobbed to the surface. I saw no sign of the pilot, but a blazing sun was sinking into the China Sea behind Corregidor. Flames leapt off the sun and were reflected in the water. The sun was unmercifully dramatizing Corregidor's ignominious plight. Knocked down by the next wave and alternately crawling and walking, I plodded 20 feet up the beach and crumbled to the comfortable sand. I remembered that it was heavy dusk, and then I fell into an exhausted sleep.
11,000 soldiers surrendered when Corregidor fell on May 6th. Lieutenant Damon "Rocky" Gause would not be one of them.
A jarring kick in the side awakened me, and there were more sharp blows along the legs and back. I'd been lying on my side. Although I opened my eyes, I was still so drugged from sleep that my reflexes were slow in responding, and I fortunately made no movement. I snapped out of my lethargy when I heard Japanese voices and men laughing. I'd been mistaken for a dead American, I was sure, and in the darkness the Japanese were enjoying the sight of another limp white body washed up on the beach. The minute they were standing around me dragged like years, and I expected at any moment for one to plunge a bayonet into my carcass just to make sure it was dead. But they straggled off toward the north, one stepping across me, his rifle butt slapping me on the back and dragging over my side. There were mountains to the south, so I took off in that direction. When I got away from the bivouac area, and after an hour's walking, I ripped the sleeves out of the shirt and wrapped them around my feet. The soles were cut and bleeding from the sharp stones and thorns, so that cloth covering felt like a pair of $15 Oxfords. The few mouthfuls I'd been able to eat only whetted my appetite and desire for water. Late in the morning, I stumbled on a brook. Whenever patrol happened along, I could hear them crashing through the undergrowth and talking long before they came in sight, and I would hide until they passed. Sometimes, while straining to make no sounds, I wondered if it was worth it.
It was at a desperate point that Rocky's kind act of helping Rita Garcia on December 8th in Manila would come back to repay him. Gause came across an 11-year-old Filipino boy who said,
"You are an American. Come with me, sir, and I'll help you hide. There are many Japanese down there, just a little ways."
The boy was the younger brother of Rita Garcia, whose family had taken to the mountains some 50 miles southwest of Manila when the Japanese arrived in the capital.
Rita and her mother begged me to remain with them at least another 10 days, but they soon realized I was anxious to push on. I told them that I'd planned to sail to Australia, and Rita believed I could make it, but Mrs. Garcia shook her head.
Rita and Rocky Gause soon set out looking for an escape route to Australia. Rita guided Gause around the region's mountain trails and low valleys.
We dodged Japanese all the time, and when resting or waiting in a native home for darkness before resuming our journey, Rita would teach me Tagalog, her native tongue.
Gause thought about Ruth at home in Georgia.
She probably believed herself a widow, since I hadn't been able to contact her since the evacuation of Manila. My prime objective was to return to my outfit and loved ones, particularly my wife, and Rita was willing to make any sacrifice that these ends might be accomplished. After seemingly endless days and nights of wandering, during which I once more entertained doubts about my chances of reaching Australia, we finally reached a small native village on the Bataan Bay. The night before we were to shove off, 300 Japanese troops entered the village and stormed about looking for American soldiers they had heard were hiding there. We set sail immediately for the island of Mindoro. When the morning came, Mindoro wasn't in sight, but we were close to Lubong, which was only 25 miles from Corregidor. The island was a discouraging sight, but we had to land, and I've never regretted it. The next month was the most pleasant of the entire trip, although it contributed some of my most trying moments.
A young Spaniard named Jose Ramos had a mountain retreat on Lubong and hid both Rocky and Rita there in sight of Corregidor, now property of Japan.
Late one afternoon, I was sitting on Joe's porch, with my feet cocked up on the rail, looking out toward the sea, when the Spaniard broke the silence with a casual, "How'd you like to make a trip to Manila?" I was suitably outfitted with a white sharkskin suit provided by a native merchant, and with a wide-brimmed straw hat characteristic of the Spaniards in the area. I let my mustache grow till it could be curled, and my sideburns grew 2 inches longer than they'd ever been in my entire life. I could speak Spanish, but not with the Filipino accent.
Gause's papers indicated his name was Ramon Gause, his well-tanned body fitting right in with the look of the Filipino locals.
Our credentials were examined several more times before we reached Manila about midnight. We were immediately taken to Joe's home and spent the night there with his mother and sisters.
The next day, Damon Rocky Gause found himself in a local Manila bar, seated next to a table full of Japanese soldiers. Joe's friend Rosita, a hostess in the bar, joined them.
I couldn't speak Spanish well enough to bandy words with these educated Japanese, so Rosita and Joe did most of the talking. I drank. In fact, I drank more than any of the others, and whenever I was asked a question, I put a glass to my mouth and turned the other way. They figured that I was drunk.
That's when the Japanese officers invited Rosita, Joe, and Rocky to join them, and wouldn't take no for an answer. After a couple hours in the bar, the Japanese officers offered to drive their new friends home.
When we stopped, the captain helped Joe get me out of the car, and both he and the colonel bid us a friendly good night, and I even recovered sufficiently to say, "Long live Japan and Viva Japan!" To any American, inquire from the bearer of this note as to my whereabouts. I have a sailboat that will accommodate 4. There are no Japanese here. I'm planning a trip to southern Mindoro, where I've contacted 50 other Americans from the Air Corps. Damon Gause, 1st Lieutenant Air Corps.
Damon Gause had sent that note out early in June via a local Filipino messenger in the hopes of finding other Americans who were hiding from the Japanese and wanted to escape to Australia. On July 4th, 1942, Captain William Lloyd Osborne from California stepped onto the opposite bank of a stream and spotted Damon Rocky Gause of Georgia.
I could see that it was a small brown man, which I immediately took for just another Filipino. But when the man moved, I knew at last I had found Gause. He started down to the edge of the water, and it was his walk that gave him away as an American.
Just before he reached our steps, I walked out to meet him, and after introducing ourselves, we clapped each other on the arms and shoulders and fairly jumped with joy. He was Captain William Lloyd Osborne, American commander of a Filipino infantry company who had escaped from Bataan and had been hiding in the jungles with a handful of his scouts. He had received my note sent by a messenger weeks ago and had seen Rita on Lubong.
I know now that he thought when he saw me on the other side that I was a Japanese. I had a beard of almost a week's growth on my face. I was dirty, sunburned, and windburned. I had lost so much weight in the last week that I looked like a living skeleton. I kept walking toward him. I thought of the famous line before I spoke. "Dr. Livingston, I presume?" Finally, I said, "Are you Lieutenant Gause of the Air Corps?" "Yes," he replied. "And who are you?" "I'm Captain Osborne. I received a note you sent back to Luzon Island about a month ago, and I remember ending lamely, 'I'm glad to know you.' At that, Gause came up to me and wrung my hand again and again. We were almost crying when we stepped apart. 'Boy, I'm sure glad to see you,' Gause said. The first thing, of course, that we both wanted to know was how each of us got off Bataan after it fell. To me, Gause's story was short of a miracle. I heard of a boat that had been confiscated by the Japanese but was lying unused on a nearby isle, which was harboring some soldiers. It wasn't much to look at, but it was a luxury liner to us. The Empress of Mindoro. The boat was 22 feet long and had an old Swedish one-cylinder diesel motor, which we named the Little Swede, and which was in pretty bad condition. Also part of the bargain was that we were to pay the equivalent of 400 pesos.
Gause and Osborne decided to name the boat after their wives, so the Empress of Mindoro was now christened the Ruth Lee.
The first time I saw the Ruth Lee, it was lying forlornly on its whitened, weather-beaten side on the beach, paint peeling off and bugs crawling all over it. At the time, I thought it had possibilities. And when Gause looked at that, he was filled almost immediately with wild enthusiasm. "Osborne," he shouted, "we are practically in Australia."
The natives knew I was preparing to leave, and they did their utmost to make my remaining few days pleasant. One even brought me an old National Geographic map of Oceania that was of estimable value to us on the voyage. I had long talks with the natives, learning the best routes, the topography of the islands we should pass, and the possible dangers we would encounter. Important supplies for the trip were gathered, few here, few there, until nothing remained between us and Australia, I foolishly believed, except a boat trip. A Filipino boy on Lubong had given me an American flag he'd taken from Corregidor after the fortress was surrendered, and I had hidden it on my boat. Captain Osborne was my army superior, and therefore entitled to give orders, which I must obey. But before shoving off, we agreed that while on the boat, I should be boss.
Gause had had more experience than I in the past, so the arrangement was, even though I outranked him, for him to be the skipper at sea and I to be in command on shore. We had an American flag that we had found when we picked up the kerosene, but we had no Japanese flag. We both agreed that we might need one later. Gause, whom I discovered to be very ingenious, settled that problem by making one out of the red part of the Filipino flag in a white sheet. We had no needle, so Gause flattened the fishhook and stuck the twine through the eyelet and sewed the flag together. Later, that flag possibly saved our lives.
Rita Garcia wanted to escape with Gause and Osborne, but was told that would be impossible. It would be the last time Rocky and Rita would ever see each other. There were tears in her eyes.
I was glad that she helped him because he helped her.
It was mid-August when we left Mindoro, and since at last we were Australia bound, I started to keep a log in a little book I'd put together on Lubong, in which I had written haphazardly up to this time.
We made Darwin our eventual goal. We figured it would take us about 45 days to make the trip, barring accidents. The southwest monsoons made the coast dangerous. Many boat travelers were never heard of again. However, we were stubborn Americans and went anyway. On August 14th, at 4 o'clock, we weighed anchor at Mindoro to start on our long trip that was to mean our freedom and chance to get into the war again, or death in one of the many forms that presented itself in both our imagination and in reality. We gave ourselves a 50-50 chance.
The wind and rain that slashed down on our craft the rest of the night and the turbulent seas that flowed in treacherous currents through the channels between the islands played havoc with the Ruth Lee. The first night out of Mindoro, and this added to the bodily discomfort caused by seasickness, a Japanese ship overtook us. I only knew 2 Japanese words, and purging my mind to recall the code, I flashed "Banzai Nippon," long live Japan. For seconds, there was no answer from the boat that could only have been a transport. So I spelled out the words "Banzai Nippon" once more, and prayed that the letters were right. After what seemed like an intolerably long time, the Japanese blinker went into action again, and we got the proceed signal.
The Ruth Lee was on her way into the monstrous South China Sea. The Americans looked at their National Geographic map and decided their first stop would be on the shores of the world's largest leper colony, on the island of Kulyon.
The leper city was an inviting little place, except for the disease connected with it.
There were American medical people on the island, and the leaking Ruth Lee was already in need of some repairs and supplies.
The doctors convinced us that leprosy was not as easy to contract as people believed. A high wire fence divided Kulyon, with about 500 non-lepers living on one side, where we spent our time, and possibly 5,000 lepers living on the other. Dr. Wade had a compass at the hospital he wanted to give us. It was a serious need. So one afternoon, I bumped my nerve up and crossed the barrier to the leper side.
I must say I was tempted just to sit out the war in the Kulyon leper colony, but not Gause. He had his Irish up again, and he informed me that we were going to get the hell out of there the minute the boat was ready. I accused him of being afraid of lepers, and he replied, "Boy, you're not kidding."
One of the doctors presented Gause with a compass. The Ruth Lee's engine, Little Swede, was fixed up, and supplies were loaded aboard the ship. After 6 days, the Americans were once again on their way south.
By this time, everyone in the colony had heard of us, and there was a large crowd at the beach to see us off, lepers on their side of the dividing line. The Ruth Lee was now lumbering along and bucking the strong southwest monsoon, which made sailing out of the islands at that time of year particularly difficult. Day and night, we pitched in the heavy seas, making only about 20 or 30 miles a day. The motor became temperamental again, and would run one day and then lay off for 2. Sometimes it would run for 8 hours and then rest for 18. You might think it had a union card.
When the Little Swede did refuse to work, the 2 Americans hoisted a sail that took advantage of the prevailing winds.
We were covering the area along the reef-strewn shore of Palawan Island by this time. The Little Swede was operating haphazardly when one morning we rounded a promontory and saw a Japanese seaplane rocking gently at anchor. The disk on the side looked as big as a silver dollar. When we made another point and passed out of sight, they were still firing wildly, cursing and trying to start their boat. But we took no chances on the disposition of the Japanese motor and immediately started zigzagging in the small, scattered islands. In a quiet lagoon, we hid the boat under the overhanging branches and waited anxiously for nightfall. We heard the Japanese launch and anchor. We camouflaged the boat with mangrove boughs, palms, and straw, and waited for darkness so that we could continue until dawn. One day, after we were carefully hidden, we heard the sputtering and roar of airplane motors and discovered that we were a stone's throw away from a Japanese airfield. As the night wore on, the wind died and the sails flapped helplessly on the mast. Dawn found us still in full view of Puerto Princesa, so we hoisted the Japanese flag and tried to look as much like a Japanese fishing boat as possible. When sailing at night, Our little compass was illuminated by a shaded flashlight bulb, but we still depended heavily on the stars. You can't imagine how dark it is in the Sulu Sea in the dead of night in a creaking 20-foot boat. About the 1st of September, we reached what had been Brooks Point. Now, only a few deserted buildings stood. Also at Brooks Point was Miss Nancy Howland, a Methodist missionary from Indiana who had just escaped from Puerto Princesa, just ahead of the Japanese, with the help of a few of her students. She was then living with the family of one of her pupils and gave us a box camera and 8 rolls of film, on which we took many pictures of military importance on the trip out through the Dutch East Indies. She was a courageous woman of great devotion. I hoisted the mainsail, disregarding the advice of the Filipinos who shook their heads and muttered, "Storm, better wait." I smiled back at them and said it was only a local condition and would be worse than dozens of other storms we'd weathered thus far.
For some time I had been conscious of a high wind and an ominous black sky, so that when we finally stepped into the Ruth Lee to embark on our journey, it could no longer be ignored that a storm was to be our companion on the sea that first night. It was monsoon weather, and the natives had warned us many times that only fools and criminals attempted to negotiate the dangerously narrow passage out of that seacoast barrio during that season. I had never been in a storm at sea before. Never have I felt so completely helpless. Lightning cracked and flashed all around us. Thunder roared, sounding familiarly like the big guns in the battle on Bataan. For 5 hours we floundered around there in that channel.
I could look out of the corner of my eye and see the shadows of the huge waves towering above my shoulder, and instinctively I'd cringe. There was no let-up in the wind. It blew at least 70 miles per hour steadily, and the roar and whirl of the water and wind made it virtually impossible to attract the attention of Osborne, who labored with the bucket less than 10 feet away. Osborne's every move was a struggle, I knew. Suddenly, there was a noticeable lull in the storm. A calmness seemed to settle over everything. I looked up at the flying clouds and cocked my head to listen. The wind had been screaming in my ears so long, I wondered if I'd lost my hearing. But sure enough, the wind was dying away. Osborne, too, had noticed the change and straightened up and turned his grimy face toward me hopefully. Then, straight from the left, the typhoon returned in redoubled fury. If Osborne could have heard me, he'd have recognized a groan. The gale caught us broadside and picked the Ruth Lee up like a twig and bent her over. All the next day, the typhoon continued without let-up. Actually, I was more frightened by that storm than any other time since I left Manila for Bataan. Both Osborne and I tied ourselves more securely to the boat, and I braced my feet and struggled hard with the tiller. Every time a wave struck, it nearly tore the handle out of my grasp. We'd rise 15 feet to the top of a wave and then drop at roller coaster speed and with a rolling twist. No sooner than we felt the sand grinding on the bottom, we both dropped in complete exhaustion into sleep, but not before we thanked God for our deliverance. We learned from the natives that we had landed in Cagayan, Sulu. They told us the direction of Borneo and replenished our supplies of rice and gave us 8 bunches of bananas and many coconuts. Around September 14th, we started the Little Swede, and the island we had been happy to see faded into the distance. We were Borneo bound.
All along their journey to Australia, Gause and Osborne relied on the local natives to provide them with updates on the activities of the Japanese. The natives also provided the 2 American escapees with whatever provisions they could spare: food, water, coconut oil for their engine, anything that would help them survive and keep the Ruth Lee afloat. The islanders' hatred of the Japanese was intense.
Bananas and coconuts were our diet for the next few days, although Osborne cooked rice when the weather allowed. Once in a while, I'd dangle a line over the side and haul in a fish, which was eaten post-haste. I was relaxing at the tiller one afternoon, watching the sun dip into the west, when I heard a horrible gurgling in the water behind. Then, right out of the middle of the mass of white foaming water, belched the conning tower of a submarine. and we saw a huge, dripping red disk on the side. The setting sun glinted off the shiny surface, and as soon as my mind began to function, I turned and shut off the engine so that our intruder wouldn't wonder how a native fishing boat happened to be motor-powered. The decks were above water only seconds when a hatch forward of the conning tower opened, and 3 sailors emerged and ran toward their forward gun. "This is the end," I murmured to Osborne, and prepared to go over the side. They fiddled around the gun for perhaps a minute, never once looking our way, and then re-entered the hatch. 2 days later, we sighted land, and from its extent, we were sure that it was British North Borneo. The sun was now becoming hotter than I'd ever thought possible. Thirst was our main problem.
We didn't once think of going back or stopping where we were. It was an unspoken thought between us that the chance we were taking was worth it. Let me say here and now, too, that for good, pure old American guts, Gause had them. He had determination far above the average man on that trip. He had good common sense, and he had courage. He knew more about the boat than I did, therefore he knew more about the chance we were taking.
Our next destination was Darvell Bay, on the eastern coast of Borneo.
In fact, Gause fooled me about the true condition of the boat clear to Australia. It was an interesting thing as to how completely opposite we were. I worried about the boat, and Gause worried about encountering the Japanese. For some reason or other, I was never much concerned about the Japs, so in that way we could more or less cover the entire field of worry. Whether it was worry, prayers, faith, we shall never know. The boat leaked, storms came, Japs passed us by. Somehow we kept afloat and traveled on.
We were still in the Inter-Islands Passage at nightfall, and the conditions we encountered were almost as bad as the typhoon. The daily threat of coral reefs was doing much to keep our nerves on edge.
He seemed to have a sixth sense that always came to the fore when the boat got into a tight spot.
We were crossing the much-traveled, by the enemy, Makassar Strait, and saw on different occasions warships lying helpless on the beach or submerged with their superstructure above the water. When we were several days past Makassar, we were again overtaken by a sudden tropical storm and blown ashore on a small rocky volcanic island near Bali. We just existed in the boat, moving only when we had to. It was maddening to be so close to our goal, and yet so far. I'd gone through so much that, well, I didn't think I could stand anymore. The Japanese were thicker on these waters than buzzards around a battlefield, sparring for an opening to stab into Australia. I knew it was dangerous now to be traveling in the daylight, so we changed our tactics, and we sailed only at night. On occasions, they passed so close that we heard enemy soldiers laughing and talking on the decks. The next day, we sighted the Celebes and anchored in about 6 fathoms of water because rocks and reefs made a landing impossible. We sailed down the long western coast of the Celebes for what seemed like weeks, every mile looking like the one before it. Early in the morning of September 27th, we swung toward an open-looking space in the coastline. We were chugging into shore. As we got a little closer, I spotted the glint of sun on steel. It was a small village on Samemba Island.
The shore is lined with guns, I yelled at Gause. There's a Jap flag waving over a building, too. Let's get out of here.
Ruth Lee now set out on one of the most trying legs of the journey. We were low on water and food. The following day, the wind subsided, and we pushed out southward again for the island of Sumatra in the Java group. Moving slowly by night, we finally reached the southern coast of Timor, from which we expected to strike due south across the broad, reef-strewn Indian Ocean to the wild and isolated shores of northern Australia. We were in the Timor Sea, I was sure. Now we were getting right down into the Japanese battle zone, where they were carrying the fight against Australia. So we made up our minds that we would see many Japanese ships before our voyage ended. Some of the toughest sailing was still ahead, because we had to negotiate the Japanese cordon between the Indies and Australia and cross several hundred miles of open water. About 4 o'clock, the sound of a lone plane engine could be heard. The plane caromed down at the WWII out of the sun. I saw spurts of flame from each wing, and bullets ripped through the boat. The sail and rigging had been riddled, but as the plane zoomed across us no more than 100 feet off the water, I hauled in the American flag and replaced the red disc banner, hoping like a schoolboy that the Japanese pilot might be fooled. Then from 300 feet out, the pilot let go a burst from his wing guns and a 20-millimeter cannon, and a bullet that zinged so close to my ear grazed Osborne in the shoulder. It wasn't serious, however. An incendiary had punctured our fuel oil cans, and heavy black smoke and ugly red flames licked out from the cabin. Osborne clapped a handkerchief to his injured shoulder. The boat was sinking so fast that the source of fire was soon submerged. The sail and rigging had been riddled. The WWII seemed to sink just so far, and then to stop. Osborne had taken up his bailing duties again, in spite of his wound and close escape. In this way, I plugged more than a dozen holes during the next 15 minutes, until Osborne's bailing began to empty the boat of water. We were lying almost becalmed, a couple hundred miles off the Australian shore, with the equatorial sun blazing down on us, and water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. 3 days later, we were still at sea, plowing southward, but oh, so slowly. We'd been so long without water that our bodies had stopped perspiring, and our skin was stiff.
I saw Gause at the tiller and watched the man who had been my companion, and realized for the first time that in spite of our constant association of 5 months, I did not know the man. I knew he was hard. I knew he had courage and determination far more than the average man. There was a job to do, a pinpoint on the map to reach.
Perhaps that, plus our weakened condition, is why we didn't notice land until we were within hailing distance, if we could have shouted. The coast was wild and desolate looking, but when the WWII buried her prow in the sandy bottom, both Osborne and I fell over the side and crawled to the beach. I know now how Columbus must have felt when he first landed in the New World. I was almost hysterical with joy, and let the Australian sand stream through my fingers like a gold-crazed miner.
The night of October 6, Gause came out of the small cabin bearing the American flag. He did not glance at me, but with jutting jaw and determined, belligerent swagger, raised that flag on the stern staff of the boat. The wind caught it and waved it there alone, a challenge and an uncompromising symbol of our race, our land, our ideals, and yes, our courage. For there was no assurance that the flag would mean our salvation. "Well, I'll be damned," Gause finally said softly to no one in particular. "I'll just be damned." "One thing," I said, "I don't think the Japanese have taken this place. I don't think anyone but the Australians would want it. By the way," I added casually, "do you have any idea where we are?" Gause sat quietly for a few minutes and wriggled his bare brown toes. "Nope," he said at last. "Frankly, I don't have any idea."
How the little Swede kept running, I don't know. Its oil well was bone dry, and every movement was a clank and a rasp. Water sloshed about on the bottom of the boat, and we had little interest in bailing. One afternoon, 3 days after we'd sighted land, we were moving slowly along the coast, and I fished out a pencil and painfully scribbled a list of things I wanted to do as soon as we'd reached civilization. But I think the coastline was the most rugged and isolated I have ever seen. We went ashore every day and were able to scrape just enough water out of the rocky pools to keep us alive. Sometimes, too, we saw boats and planes that could only have been Allied, and though we fired our guns and waved our flag, we were never noticed. Then began a stumbling procession up and down the beach, looking for water. We both had expected that our troubles would be at an end when we reached Australia. At last, we discovered a few mouthfuls of flat rainwater collected in depressions and rocks along the beach. We just about licked them dry, and then returned to the boat, sorely disappointed. We were somewhere west of Port Darwin.
Gause was constantly worrying as to whether he could possibly make it to Darwin or Wyndham in time to send his wife a telegram for their first wedding anniversary.
He told me when he and Osborne was coming across the ocean that they would pray. He was a true soldier for his country and for God. And he said it was God who helped him get across that ocean.
I estimate we're only about 30 miles from Wyndham. We'll have to backtrack about 15 miles. We backtracked for 15 miles and found ourselves in the bay again, and lost again. Finally, Gause pointed toward a small opening out in the rocks, about 200 yards away, and turning the boat toward it, he said, "This may be it, mate." And it was. The minute I saw the opening and we were through it, I felt for sure we were in the right passageway. The channel began to get larger after we were in through the opening, and looked as though we had at last hit the right passage, which we knew would lead us to Wyndham.
I called to Osborne, who was slumped in a bunk, and asked him wearily if he saw anything. He raised himself on one elbow and answered that it looked like a boat, so I knew there definitely was something on the river. By this time, the craft had drawn much closer, and I saw a dozen tall, sunburned Australian soldiers crowded into the front of the boat observing us. If I could have shouted with relief and joy, I believe I would have done so.
I almost gave up hope that we would never make Wyndham.
Although there was no danger that would pass us unnoticed, Osborne and I gestured wildly at the Aussies. We were so dirty and our boat was so sleazy, they must have considered us maniacs or Japanese. They circled us slowly with their guns pointed menacingly in our direction, and at the same time, we held our hands above our heads and turned slowly too, facing their boat at all times.
As we swung our feet to friendly earth for the first time, Gause and I looked at one another. A feeling of peace, a sense of great accomplishment. Gause and I fell over one another trying to get our story told. It sounded fantastic, I'll admit, but they were finally convinced and gave us all the water and food and cigarettes we could stand. We went ashore to eat, and the Aussies sat around and watched open-mouthed as we ate and drank again without looking up from our food or speaking. We thanked them profusely and returned to the Ruth Lee with a guide they'd furnished us. And just after sundown, in the middle of October, we reached Wyndham. Gause wrote in the log on October 11th at noon, the next to the last entry. "Today is our lucky day, my wedding anniversary. We'll arrive in Wyndham about 7:30 this evening. Thank God." Then the last entry in the diary. 19:30 hours, October 11th, 1942. Position, moored at the dock in Wyndham, Western Australia. We'll close this log with much relief and rejoicing. Damon J. Gause, Winder, Georgia.
Damon Rocky Gause and William Lloyd Osborne had spent 52 days at sea, in some of the roughest conditions possible, dodging their Japanese enemy at almost every turn. They had left the Philippines on August 14th and traveled some 3,200 miles in an old wooden fishing boat with a sputtering engine that could have stopped working entirely almost from the time they left. Now in Wyndham, Australia, they were being hailed as heroes.
At times, I found it hard to believe that I was actually in Australia and safe.
After 10 months of constant danger, hunger, and prayer, we were truly returning to our country. Gratitude and wonder walled within me, and I could find no words to express. After we had settled our belongings, we were summoned to report to General MacArthur.
We were bundled into an elevator and whisked upwards. I was announced, stepped into the general's office, walked to his desk, and saluted. "Sir, Lieutenant Gause reports for duty from Corregidor." The general returned my salute, peered intently at us, slowly rose, and exclaimed, "Well, I'll be damned." Yes, we were indeed a strange sight. That night, after receiving medical attention and more food and liquid, I lay on a soft bed and my mind ran back over the journey to Rita, Joe, Aranzazo, and the doctors at Kuyan, and the thousands of others who risked their lives and probably died, that I, a lone hunted American, might live and return to my forces and homeland. I was not an expert at navigation or favorable winds or even courage, but by the grace of God and the Filipinos, I could sleep safely once more. I fell asleep that night and many thereafter, saying, Mabuhay los Filipinos. Long live the Filipinos.
A telegram reached Ruth Gause back in Georgia, informing her that her husband was no longer missing in action and presumed dead.
Oh, I was just thrilled to death. I was just thrilled to death.
Despite not hearing from Rocky Gause in months, Ruth Gause had never lost hope.
I always felt like he was alive. You know, I didn't worry. I just somehow felt like he was alive. And he really was.
Dearest Ruth, I brought another officer out with me. He is my blood friend now. I want you to meet him someday. I wish you were here with me. I love you more than ever, Ruth. Keep your chin up, honey, and I'm sure everything will work out okay with us. Devotedly yours, Rocky.
Rocky Gause was promoted to captain and flown home to the United States in November of 1942. Captain Damon Gause was given a 30-day pass to return home to Jefferson, Georgia.
I looked at him and I thought, well, are you alive? How in the world are you alive?
90 days later, Ruth Gause found out she was pregnant with the couple's first child. Rocky's days in combat were over, according to the United States Army. He had done more than enough. His new orders found him behind a desk, with an old Japanese flag serving as a much trampled-on welcome mat in his office.
He wanted to go back and fight the Japs, but he wasn't permitted to go back and fight the Japs because he had been taken prisoner, and they knew if they found him again, it would be too bad, and so they wouldn't let him go back.
Damon Gause was told he would now help the war effort by traveling around the southeastern part of the country promoting the sale of war bonds. One of those stops came in Jefferson.
And I remember my mom and daddy carried me over there in the high school gym, and they had Ruth and him on the stage and some other people. And he brought out the Jap flag he had, threw it down on the stage and stomped it with his feet. And everybody just clapped and hollered and raised canes when he did all that.
We couldn't move without newspaper people following us. We never could be together by ourselves without the news people with us. We never talked over the war when we were together. I think I didn't want to hear the bad part. I just sort of turned it off.
Rocky Gause had survived one of the most incredible escapes of World War II, but selling war bonds and sitting behind a desk was not what he wanted. A personal appeal to General Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Corps, got Rocky back to active duty status in the summer of 1943. Gause was assigned to the 365th Fighter Group based in Richmond, Virginia. On December 7, 1943, Ruth Gause gave birth to a baby boy, Damon Lance Gause. That same day, Rocky was promoted to major. Before leaving for Europe, Major Gause arrived in Jefferson to meet his new son.
He got permission from the colonel, and they let him slip away to come to the hospital when his son was born. But he just stayed several hours and had to go right back.
The 365th was being shipped to England. By December 23, 1943, Major Damon Gause was back in the fight, this time in the skies over Europe. In early 1944, Rocky was flying bomber escort missions over Germany in a P-47. On March 9, 1944, Damon Gause was testing a P-47 Thunderbolt fighter at an altitude of 30,000 feet. Rocky went into a scheduled dive in his plane, but his fighter never pulled up, crashing into a field south of London near the Isle of Wight. Damon Jesse Rocky Gause the American hero who escaped Bataan and Corregidor and survived a 3,200-mile, 52-day escape from the Japanese aboard a creaky old Filipino fishing boat, was dead. Word soon reached Jefferson, Georgia.
I was living with my mother and daddy, and they was up there working in the garden. And I was coming down the steps, just got to the bottom step, and I looked and saw this guy coming up with a message in it, with a telegram in his hand, and I could tell by his expression it was something that wasn't good. But I just told him, I says, hand it to me, I can take it. So it said, killed in Bellew, England, March 9, 1944. And that's all it said.
I really was shook up about it when it happened.
They had a nice memorial service here at the First Baptist Church, and it was just loaded with people from Winder and Jefferson attended the memorial service.
Major Damon Rocky Gause is buried in the American Military Cemetery in England, alongside so many other boys who fought for their country in World War II and never came home. His white cross indicates nothing about the character, determination, courage, heroics, and patriotism that brought him to this very place. It's the way Rocky Gause would have wanted it.
Well, they sent me a great big wooden box, and the footlocker was in that wooden box. All of his stuff was in that wooden box. It had the paddle that he used from the Philippines. That paddle was in that box too. All of his personal stuff was in that big box. And his manuscript was in it also.
Ruth Gause was a war widow at the age of 22. Preserving the legacy and story of Damon Rocky Gause has become a sense of pride for the entire Gause family.
Here's the Georgia Aviation Hall of Fame.
Today, Lance Gause and his sister Ginger are the caretakers. Before them, it was their father Damon, the only child of Rocky and Ruth Gause, who made sure his father's incredible World War II journey did not fade into history. Damon L. Gause took his dad's worn diary and combined it with a more formal manuscript Rocky himself had written following his return from Australia. With the help of a University of Georgia professor, the only child of Rocky and Ruth Gause carved out a non-fiction survival story for the ages. Not only have Rocky's words been preserved, but the artifacts from his journey have been too.
This thing is, it's got a needle that goes each way. This is the leveling. This is a compass that they used, and it's got, it's hard to imagine going 3,200 miles with just this instrument to go by. But they never did truly feel lost.
The compass and map used by Gause and Osborne on the trip could probably still get them where they needed to be today.
Which was to Australia.
Yeah, that's right. And this was his old hat. You can see it on a lot of his pictures when he's on the boat.
The American flag that once flew over Corregidor and was hoisted so many times aboard the Ruth Lee is here.
Look at the old handle and the... I wonder what that notch is for.
It goes on the end of a rifle. It's a notch on the end of a Springfield rifle, yeah. That was actually a World War I surplus bayonet that was being used in World War II, just because it was simply surplus from the First World War, and it was used all the way through the Second World War.
An oar that was used aboard the Ruth Lee remains well preserved. The denim shorts worn by Rocky during the escapes from Bataan, Corregidor, and then across the vast Pacific Ocean haven't faded. Telegrams sent by the War Department to Ruth, updating her on her husband's war status, remain legible. Some 50 photos taken on the trip with that old camera given to them during the middle of their journey remain as clear as the day they were taken. All document a story almost too incredible to have happened.
He just continuously held on to his willpower and his love for his country in his will to survive and get back to his family and his wife, which was my grandmother, Ruth. And he never gave up. He kept on fighting. And that's just incredible in itself of what, you know, all of the men were enduring there.
There's a hero's name on a headstone someplace overseas, a decorated warrior who came from the same little town as me. I've read all about him and the hell that he lived through, fighting in the Army Air Corps back in World War II. Even General MacArthur said, well, I'll be damned when he heard the tale of a soldier who broke the grip of the enemy's hand, saying, it ain't my time, no it ain't my time, no it ain't my time to go. He was down in the South Pacific, holding on while the Philippines fell. He got caught outside of Manila, outflanked and out of shells. So they filed him into the death march at the end of a bayonet. But he killed a guard and went running off into the wilderness. And he swam into the ocean, across the sea to Corregidor. Helped the 4th Marines hold the fort down till the Japs were coming through their front door, saying, it ain't my time, no it ain't my time, no it ain't my time to go. And he sailed through blue and stormy waters, 3,000 miles, with faith in God and a compass arrow, dodging fire 3,000 miles. When he found his way to freedom, they pinned a medal on his chest, sent him back to Georgia, to the girl he loved and the life he'd missed. Meanwhile, the war kept raging, so he couldn't rest here long. Volunteered to go back into action after just over 9 months at home. Only imagine how hard it must have been to leave his wife and a newborn baby and go running into the fire again, saying it's my time, oh it's my time, honey, it's my time to go. Oh, it's my time, oh, it's my